Imagine waking up on an ordinary day and discovering that the disappearance of a teenage girl might be tied to the darkest secrets of the Vatican. A young girl, a sacred city, and a truth that feels forbidden. What began as a simple search for a missing teenager turned into one of the deepest unsolved mysteries in modern history. And what you're about to hear is real, very real. It was a muggy Wednesday afternoon, June 22nd, 1983. The newly begun summer made the streets of Rome throb with tourists, students, priests, and locals milling about under the clear sky and warm sun. Amidst the hustle and bustle, White Valisi, a young girl of just 15 years old, left home for yet another music lesson. An ordinary day, a simple routine. But that journey, lasting just a few minutes between the walls of Vatican City and the city center, would mark the beginning of one of the darkest cases in modern history. Bianca was the daughter of a Vatican employee, and she lived inside the Holy City itself, one of the most guarded, sacred, and closed places in the world. The security, the gates, the Swiss guards, and the constant presence of religious figures and authorities gave her family the certainty that they were protected. It was unthinkable to imagine that anything could happen to a girl there in that sacred and politically shielded haven. But when the sun set and Bianca didn't come home, what seemed impossible became a never-ending nightmare. Initially, the reaction was one of denial. Maybe she had gotten distracted, maybe she was with friends, maybe, just maybe. But the hours passed, night fell, and the phones remained silent. Anxiety gave way to panic. Her mother called acquaintances, her father walked the streets and hallways, and the police were called, but slowly. In a city like Rome, it was not uncommon for teenagers to disappear for a few hours, run away, get distracted, come back later. That was the justification given by the authorities at first. But anyone who knew Bianca knew that it didn't make sense. She was responsible, discreet, shy. She would never disappear of her own free will. And then the rumors began. A classmate said she had seen her talking to a strange man near the entrance to her classroom. Another said a black car with tinted windows had been circling the area for the past few days. A street vendor recalled that she had seemed nervous that afternoon looking around, but none of these reports were conclusive. No one had any proof. No one knew for sure. And most disturbing of all, the Vatican, which could hold the key to speeding up the investigation with its resources and contacts, remained completely silent. The case was becoming increasingly disturbing. It wasn't just a case of a missing young woman. It was the daughter of someone with direct access to the inner halls of the church. Speculation was growing. The media began to question, what did the Vatican know? Why was the case being handled so cautiously? Who was trying to keep the story from coming to light? In the days that followed, the mood within the Valisi family was one of growing despair. Prayers became constant. The candles are lit permanently. Friends gathered to seek answers, but everything seemed blocked by an invisible wall. Bianca had disappeared, and with it, the trust that so many families placed in the idea that the Vatican was a place untouchable by evil also disappeared. The teenager's disappearance was no longer just a tragic event. It became the center of a shadow that hung over the city, involving institutions, authorities, and faith. It was the beginning of a mystery that would not only shake up an entire family, but the symbolic structure of one of the most powerful and secretive organizations in the world. A few days after Bianca Valesi disappeared, when hope was already giving way to absolute despair, the family's home phone rang. It was night, her father answered. On the other end of the line, a man's voice, slow, emotionless, apparently foreign. The call was quick, to the point. The man said he knew where Bianca was, and most disturbing of all, he identified himself only as the American. Nothing more, No details about who he was or where he was speaking from. Just one clear demand. If they wanted the girl back, they would have to fight for the release of a prisoner, a man who not long before had shocked the world. The person mentioned was the author of the attack on the Pope, which occurred in 1981. The reference was direct. The message: if the Vatican wanted to save Bianca's life, it should use its influence to release a terrorist. And with that, something broke inside that house. The disappearance, until then treated as a possible escape, or perhaps a common crime, was becoming something much bigger. Now, it was part of a game of international blackmail, political games, and shady alliances. This was no longer just a police case. It was a message. The calls continued, always with the same voice, always with new information, details about Bianca, what she was wearing, the route she took, information that had not yet been made public. It was as if this man knew more than any investigator, as if he was in on everything. The authorities began to take the hypothesis seriously. Could extremist groups have kidnapped the girl to pressure the Vatican? Could we be facing an international blackmail operation using a teenager as a pawn? The church, under pressure, remained silent. Officially, no connection was confirmed. No hypothesis was accepted, and this only increased the feeling that something very serious was being hidden. Public opinion was divided. Some believed in the version of the kidnapping as being politically motivated. Others, more skeptical, thought it was a smokescreen, that the connections could be a distraction. But why? And in whose service? Meanwhile, the family was consumed by suffocating anguish. Bianca's father wrote down every detail of the connections. The devastated mother tried to maintain her sanity between candles, prayers, and letters of support from strangers. The young woman's face began to appear on posters throughout the streets of Rome, but they were no ordinary posters. They were accompanied by theories, doubts, and a growing fear that Bianca's disappearance would not have a happy ending. Dark speculations were beginning to surface in the press. Some said the kidnapping was actually a veiled message to important figures within the Vatican, a reminder that no one there was above the influence of occult forces, not even the church. Others pointed out that the information in the phone calls was so precise that it could only have come from someone with privileged access, someone from within. And so the mystery grew. With each new call, more fear. With each new silence from the Vatican, more suspicion. And at the center of it all, a missing young girl, a father waiting, a mother in silent mourning, and an entire system teetering on the possibility that Bianca had been used as currency in a game that should never have involved a child. Time passed. The phone calls stopped. The clues, once strange and fragmented, ceased. But the fear, it grew. With each week without an answer, the case of Bianca Valesi was no longer just a family drama, but a black hole in the credibility of the institutions. The questions continued. Where was she? Why wasn't the Vatican saying anything? Who was the American? But the most disturbing was yet to come, when rumors began to point to a connection with Italy's darkest underworld, the Mafia. The first mentions appeared discreetly among investigative journalists and former members of criminal groups. The name that was circulating was that of Magliana Band, a criminal organization that had been operating in Rome since the 1970s. More than just a common gang, it was known for its connections with politicians, businessmen, and, even more shocking, with sectors of the Vatican itself. The theory that was beginning to gain traction was brutal. Bianca could have been kidnapped as a bargaining chip in a dispute involving power, money, and silence. Suspicions revolved around the Institute for Religious Works, better known as the Vatican Bank. Since the 1980s, allegations of money laundering, fraud, and embezzlement have been hanging over the institution. Large sums of money from the Italian mafia are said to have passed through secret accounts within the sacred bank. And when, for some reason, part of this money is said to have disappeared, the response was straightforward: a kidnapping. An innocent girl used as blackmail to recover money or ensure silence. The evidence was scant, but the pattern made sense to anyone familiar with the mafia's methods: indirect threats, symbolic messages, and the use of relatives of insiders as a form of coercion. Bianca's father, even though he was a mid-level official, was involved in the Vatican's inner workings, and it was possible that he had heard or seen something he shouldn't have. Or worse, perhaps he himself didn't know why his daughter had been chosen. But someone certainly did. As the mafia entered the radar of unofficial investigations, the behavior of the authorities became increasingly suspicious. The Italian police were not releasing updates. The Vatican refused to cooperate with certain requests. And the files on Bianca's disappearance seemed locked behind layers of bureaucracy and ecclesiastical vetting. It was as if the case was surrounded by an invisible and impenetrable wall. Journalists began to receive threats. Some stories were mysteriously taken off the air. Confidential sources disappeared. In the midst of all this, the family's pain grew worse. They felt that they were being ignored by those who were supposed to protect them. The church, which preached compassion and justice, now seemed like a cold and silent stone castle in the face of the tragedy of one of its own. By this time, Bianca's case was no longer just a personal tragedy. It was an open wound in the heart of Rome. A symbol that, even among saints and basilicas, invisible forces dictated the rules. And the more people talked about the mafia, the clearer it became that there were many players in this game, but none of them wanted the truth to come out. Years passed, decades in fact, and the name of Bianca Valesi had become more than just that of a missing teenager. It had become synonymous with institutional silence, conspiracy, a wound that time would not heal. Her family continued to search for answers, facing neglect and indifference from the authorities. But at a certain point, something emerged from the shadows. A letter, anonymous, sent directly to the family, and inside it precise information. A tomb located within the walls of the Vatican itself could hide a decades-old secret. The accusation was clear and frightening. The alleged location was an ancient tomb, unopened for a long time and believed to be linked to historical members of the church. The message suggested that Bianca's body had been secretly buried there as a way to hide evidence and avoid an even greater scandal. The suggestion that someone had buried a kidnapped young woman inside the Vatican, it wasn't just shocking, it was the kind of revelation that could shatter centuries of the Holy See's credibility. With public pressure mounting and after intense negotiations, the Vatican relented and authorized the opening of the tomb. Cameras were positioned, experts were called in, and the entire world waited for an outcome, a miracle or the final horror. When the workers lifted the heavy stone lid, what they found inside was nothing. Absolutely nothing. No bones, no remains, no answers. It was as if the tomb had been emptied years ago, or as if it had never held anyone. The frustration was immediate. For the family, it seemed like another blow. For the press, another smokescreen. But fate seemed to play with those involved, because a few days later, in an event that seemed unbelievable, human bones found near Vatican Embassy in Rome during maintenance works. The connection was inevitable. Could these be Bianca's remains? The location, the timing, the coincidence, everything seemed too aligned to be dismissed. The authorities collected the material and sent it for forensic examination. The anticipation was overwhelming. The country came to a standstill. The international Media covered every detail. Finally, after so long, would there be an answer? But the results were inconclusive. The bones belonged to a teenage girl. Yes, but the year of death could not be determined with any precision, and the genetic material was too compromised to confirm the identity with certainty. Was it Bianca? Was it another victim? Was it another warning, a piece of snare strategically thrown in to confuse the situation? With each new clue, the labyrinth became deeper. What seemed like progress turned into more darkness, and all the while the Vatican returned to silence. No official statement about the bones, no acknowledgement of guilt, no attempt at reparation, as if all this were just another stone placed over a truth that should never emerge. The Velesi family, even in the face of so much pain, continued. With each frustrated discovery, hope was rekindled, even if only for a short time. They weren't just looking for a body, they were looking for justice. They were trying to end a cycle of terror that had begun on an ordinary afternoon with a girl going to music class, and that, so many years later, continued to haunt the marble corridors of the most sacred city in the world. When it seemed that nothing more could emerge from that suffocating mystery, a new leak rekindled hopes and fears. This time, it wasn't an anonymous tip, nor a forgotten skeleton. It was an internal document, confidential, coming from the Vatican's own archives. And it brought a revelation that shook the faith of many. Bianca Velesi reportedly remained alive for years after her disappearance. And what's more, it would have been kept under special protection by the Holy See itself. The scandal began with the leaking of copies of financial records and correspondence between members of the church's top brass. Among them was the name of an influential priest linked to the Holy See's diplomatic sector, who had allegedly overseen regular payments related to the maintenance and security of a young woman staying outside Rome. The dates coincided with the first years after her disappearance. The amounts paid, the discreet accommodations, the codes used in the reports, all suggested that an operation was being conducted in absolute secrecy. But why? Why hide a missing teenager? Why not return her to her family? The hypothesis most accepted by experts was disturbing. Bianca knew too much. Perhaps she had heard, witnessed, or even participated against her will in something that could not be revealed. The darker version was that she was a living witness to some plot involving money, mafia, and sacred figures, and her living presence could ruin reputations that supported centuries-old pillars of power. The priest named in the documents was never officially charged, but journalists discovered that he had been transferred several times between parishes and diplomatic missions on different continents. Always discreetly, always with a short time in each post, as if he were being moved to keep his distance from the investigations. Interviewed briefly by foreign reporters years later, he simply said, "Many things that are said are not appropriate to say." This kind of response only fueled public outrage. Amid scandals that had already tarnished the image of the Catholic Church, such as cases of sexual abuse, corruption, and historical omissions, the Bianca Velesi case resurfaced as a symbol of the lengths to which the institution was willing to go to hide in order to protect itself. The idea that a young woman could have been comfortably silenced generated a kind of cold horror that was hard to comprehend. It was the kind of strategy one would expect from an authoritarian government, not from a church that preaches truth and acceptance. With each new fragment revealed, more questions arose. If Bianca had been alive for some time, what happened to her afterwards? Would she have been released? Would she have escaped? Or was her final silence also decreed for convenience? None of these questions have been answered. None of the people named in the documents have been formally held accountable. And the institution once again retreated into the comfortable darkness of omission. For the Valesi family, each new piece of evidence was like a double-edged sword. Hope was rekindled, but along with it came pain, anger, the feeling that everything could have been avoided, the certainty that someone somewhere decided that Bianca could not return home. As the years passed, as the spotlight of the press faded and the secret documents were shelved again, only one thing remained standing, unshaken: Bianca Valesi's family. When the whole world seemed to have forgotten her name, when the authorities were already treating the case as part of an uncomfortable past, Bianca's parents and siblings carried on, in silence, in pain, but also with a strength that surprised even the most skeptical. They didn't want revenge. They wanted the truth. This quest led them to confront one of the most powerful and closed systems on the planet, the Vatican. While most families would have remained silent in the face of institutional pressure and fear, the Valesi family refused to bow their heads. They organized vigils in front of basilicas. They distributed pamphlets, gave interviews, participated in documentaries, and knocked on doors that seemed insurmountable. And with each new silence, they raised their voices with greater courage. But this confrontation came at a high price. There were years of psychological suffering, sleepless nights, and suspicious looks even from neighbors and members of the parish itself. The pain did not come only from Bianca's absence, but from the contempt with which they were treated by those who should have been their allies. Her father, who had previously worked for the Holy See, was removed. Her mother, weakened by the loss and the legal battles, lived between hospitals and support centers. Even so, on every birthday of their daughter, they lit a candle. They left an empty chair at the table, and they remained firm in their purpose of preventing Bianca's name from being erased. For a long time, the Church's stance was one of strategic retreat. It never completely denied anything, but it never admitted anything either. Documents disappeared, priests refused to comment. Promises of support became generic phrases in cold press releases. It was as if the Vatican operated in two spheres: the public sphere, where it preached transparency and faith, and the internal sphere, where it protected its secrets at all costs. Against this structure, an ordinary family seemed too small. But it was precisely this disparity that made the Valesi's struggle so symbolic. They weren't just fighting for Bianca, they were fighting against a culture of silence, against centuries of absolute power that was rarely challenged. And in the process, they inspired others. Gradually, other families who had also been silenced by disappearances, abuse, and cover-ups began to speak out. Bianca became an icon, not by choice, but by the persistence of those who loved her. Her absence came to represent not just a personal tragedy, but a collective wound. A wound that will not heal as long as secrets remain buried beneath the stones of the Vatican. At some point, even international organizations began to quietly pressure the Vatican. Petitions were sent to the UN. Human rights organizations began to list the Bianca Valesi case as an example of institutional negligence and possible violations of civil rights. Was it too late? Perhaps. But for the Valesi family, any effort was worth it. They had lost their daughter, but they would not lose her memory either. Today, anyone who passes by the steps of St. Peter's Square on certain days of the year may come across a solitary poster, an old photo, the sweet look of a teenager who should be alive, building her life, and below, a sentence: "We are still waiting." In January 2023, after years of silence, evasions and cover-ups, the Vatican surprised everyone by announcing that would officially reopen the Bianca Valesi case. The news, reported cautiously by the international press, seemed to confirm something the family had been shouting for 4 decades, that there was much more behind the disappearance. But for many, The late reopening seemed like a public relations strategy, not a real act of justice. Was it really a search for the truth? Or just a way to relieve the public pressure that had been building up year after year? The new investigation, led by members of the Vatican prosecutor's office, promised to review all previous documents, re-evaluate leads, re-interview witnesses, and, most importantly, access secret archives from the period. For the first time, there was a public statement that no hypothesis would be ruled out. But those who knew the story closely knew the greatest enemy of truth was time itself. Evidence had disappeared. Key people were dead. Others, having grown old, no longer remembered the details. And some, perhaps, never intended to tell what they knew. In the midst of this whirlwind, the question that always lingered remained unanswered. Where is Bianca? The absence of a body, of confirmation, of an end point, turned the case into an open wound that bleeds slowly, without stopping. For the family, living without knowing is worse than any mourning. Because there is no grave, there are no flowers, there is no goodbye. Just the echo of a name that continues to resonate in walls where silence was cultivated as a defense. More than a disappearance, the Bianca Valesi case became a mirror of what institutions try to hide. Her flawed humanity, your fear of the truth, your thirst for self-protection. When faith clashes with power, when justice faces secrecy, the weakest always lose. And in this case, a 15-year-old girl paid the price for decisions that weren't hers, for alliances I never wanted to be a part of, for secrets that you may have witnessed without understanding. Today, Bianca's name is remembered not only in the corridors of the Vatican, but in documentaries, independent investigations, and movements of relatives of the disappeared. Her story has generated books, films, and debates, but none of them has managed to provide a definitive answer, because the truth deep down remains kept by someone, perhaps locked in some secret archive, perhaps buried in some forgotten crypt, or worse. Perhaps it lives in the conscience of those who, even knowing everything, chose to remain silent. And this is the scariest part of this whole story. Does anyone still know? Someone who was part of everything, someone who shook hands, who signed papers, who saw Bianca get into a car and never come out again. Someone who can, with a few words, end decades of pain, but who chooses silence. Time can erase names from headlines, it can chill investigations, it can turn tragedies into statistics. But time never completely erases what has not been resolved, and the disappearance of Bianca Valesi remains there, like a living shadow, circulating among the corridors of power, whispering in every unopened file, in every mass celebrated with pomp, in every averted glance when faced with a simple question, where is Bianca? And until that question is answered, the mystery remains. And if this story left you thinking, remember, silence protects power, but truth belongs to everyone. Help us keep telling the stories they want forgotten. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and be part of a growing voice that refuses to look away. Because the next mystery might be closer than you think.